Welcome to our tutorial sessions in the run-up to ESORICS 2021. Professor Dr. Juraj Somorovsky from Paderborn University, Germany, will talk about TLS, Transport Layer Security. He'll do this together with Robert Merget, a PhD student at the Chair for Network and Data Security at Ruhr University, Bochum. Professor Somorovsky is a security researcher at Paderborn University and co-founder of Hackmanit GmbH. He's the main developer of a flexible tool for TLS analysis, Tls Attacker. Beyond TLS, he likes to break stuff in the areas of web and crypto. Robert Merget is a PhD student at Ruhr University, Bochum. The focus of his research is TLS and the analysis of TLS implementations. He's also the maintainer of Tls Attacker and Tls Scanner. TLS is the most important cryptographic protocol. Whether web, email, phone calls, chat, or VPN, there is hardly a type of communication which cannot be secured using TLS. Due to its importance, the protocol became target of many famous attacks such as crime, drown, logjam, or padding oracles. In 2018, a new standard version was released, TLS 1.3. This version was introduced to prevent all the protocol attacks and make the communication more performant. In this hands-on tutorial, Professor Somorovsky and Robert Merget will give a short introduction to TLS 1.3 and explain how it works. Then, they will show how you can analyze TLS 1.3 using Wireshark and TLS Attacker. Please write your questions in the chat. They will read them and answer them as much as they can. Professor.
Okay, Georg, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. So I think this is the time when I can start sharing my screen. So I hope that everything will go well. So I will start sharing my desktop, and you should be now able to see my desktop where I have my presentation. So is it correct?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so again, thank you very much for coming to this tutorial. So and thank you for the nice introduction. And Georg already told a lot of us. So short, I am Juraj. I am a professor at Paderborn University, and I have here a group for system security. I like TLS and cryptographic attacks, and I was a co-author of several attacks like Robot, Alpaca, Drown, or recently Raccoon, also with my co-author here, Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert. I'm a PhD student at Ruhr University Bochum, and I'm currently the maintainer of Tls Attacker. And I also did some of the attacks Juraj participated in.
Okay, so we worked a lot together with Robert, so we decided to do this workshop or this tutorial together. And so what is common when we talk about TLS and about crypto, then a lot of people, students and so on, think that it will be very, very hard and it will not be easy to understand. So everybody is afraid of such lectures, but because there is math, there is crypto, and so on and so on. However, no worries. So in this tutorial and in this lecture, we will take everything to the high level. So there will be no crypto inside, so everything will be easy, and we will talk about the message structures and about the TLS protocol on the high level, so that you can understand it and you can analyze it using Wireshark or using other tools. So why do we talk about TLS? So everybody of you probably knows why you are here. So TLS is probably the most important cryptographic standard protocol, and we use it every time as we browse the internet and we visit our favorite websites. So for example, this Comedy Life Wildlife Photography. If we visit it and see this HTTPS log, then we know that we use TLS. TLS is, however, not only used to secure websites and HTTP. It is also used for other purposes, for securing your email communication, for example, using SMTP or IMAP protocols and securing it on below. So today, our goal is to understand the protocols that are used to secure the whole internet traffic, the most important traffic on the internet, transmitted over HTTPS, over SMTPS, and so on and so on. We will talk about the newest TLS 1.3 protocol that was released 3 years ago. However, before that, we will build on top of TLS 1.2. So why do we do this? So we do this because many of our students or our colleagues started or learned a lot about TLS 1.2 in the previous years, or maybe at the university. And we also try to introduce TLS 1.3 protocol based on TLS 1.2, so that we first show what went wrong in TLS 1.2, what attacks do we have, and then try to build a more secure protocol. So before talking about TLS 1.3, we will also take a look at TLS attacks and their diversity, and then we will learn how to analyze TLS with Wireshark or with TLS Attacker. And for this purpose, what we did, we prepared a virtual machine. So we prepared a virtual machine that you can use already during our lecture. So I'm sorry for this. So Robert, maybe you are now here. Can you maybe paste the
Sure.
visible link to our colleagues so that they can already start downloading. So we will give you the opportunity to now to use the virtual machine and download it and do our demos with us. And or you can just watch this tutorial and do it afterwards. So we will not make any breaks for this. So you can work on these exercises afterwards after the tutorial is finished. So as already mentioned, there are no prerequisites for this tutorial. So if you want to work with the virtual machine, you just need to install VirtualBox. This is where the virtual machine works or was tested. And there you should have maybe some basic knowledge of cryptos. So you should know what is the difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption schemes. And maybe you should understand or have heard of Diffie-Hellman key exchange or about signatures. So what are they used for? So don't be afraid of this. So we are not going into cryptographic attacks. We are not going talking about math. We are just going to take a look at the protocol on the very, very high level. And for this purpose, we need these concepts. So what we are going to talk about today, as already mentioned, we first are going to introduce TLS 1.2. So before we do this, we'll explain high-level basics behind TLS. So what do we do and how do we use TLS, and what are the basic concepts behind this? Then we will take a look at TLS 1.2 Handshake, how it works, and we will analyze it using Wireshark. Afterwards, we will take a look at some prominent attacks that were discussed in the area of TLS protocol, and we'll take a look at their diversity. So what are the problems of them? And afterwards, we'll introduce TLS 1.3 and our tool TLS Attacker. So as you mentioned, and I am now presenting, so we will try to keep it somehow dynamic, and we will try to somehow exchange with Robert, but we are doing this remotely and for the first time, and I'm the presenter. Robert is now waiting for his call, but so please, we are doing this for the first time. So if we do some mistakes, don't think about it. Okay, so let's start with high-level basics. And for this purpose, so let's first take a look at the whole overview of of the TLS protocol and how it evolved. So TLS, as already mentioned, is probably the most important cryptographic protocol. So it was developed already in the 90s. So it was developed back then by Netscape developers. So there was a Netscape browsers, and the developers implemented a so-called SSL version 2 protocol. This was the first published version of of the secure protocol, which was directly after a release completely broken. So directly after a release, we could see a new protocol called SSL version 3, which was used as a basic for the new protocol, which was taken over by IETF. So it was officially standardized and adopted by IETF and renamed to Transport Layer Security. So the first version of Transport Layer Security was developed around 1999, and its version was TLS 1.0. Internally, the version was actually SSL version 3.1 because it was some kind of improvement to the secure sockets layer protocol that we have seen in the 1996. Okay, so with the time, we could observe new developments and improvements in the area of TLS, and new versions were released, TLS 1.1 and 1.2, which made some minor changes to cryptographic algorithms, and TLS 1.3 completely changed the protocol flow, it changed the algorithms, and it tried to be much more secure protocol. So transport layer security is called transport layer security because it works between the transport layer and application layer protocol. On the very, very high level, the transport layer security protocol consists of two phases. So in the first phase, we have a so-called TLS Handshake, where our client, in this case, it's Tessa. Tessa is a dog, and she likes to browse the internet securely. So what she does, she connects to the secure server using a TLS Handshake. And in this TLS Handshake, we select algorithms, versions, extensions, some key exchange algorithms. We exchange cryptographic material. And in the second phase, after we have performed the TLS Handshake, we can exchange encrypted and authenticated data. For example, using algorithms like ASGCM, CBC, ChaCha, and so on and so on. So as you can see here, so probably the TLS Handshake is the most important part of the protocol because it is used for transmitting the data, for communication, for transmitting the data and establishing the communication with the server, and also establishing the secure connection keys. So when we talk TLS Handshake, or when we talk TLS, we need to send specific messages. And so all the data that we exchange with the server, or the client exchange with the server, are exchanged in specific formats, and these formats are transmitted in handshake messages, for example, to establish the TLS Handshake. For example, then alert messages, which define specific alerts, or application messages, which exchange the real data that we need to communicate with. So for example, HTTP data. So we will introduce this because we will need it later in order to talk or to use our analysis with Wireshark. Okay, so application data is our message that we use for data exchange. So for example, if we want to exchange HTTP data. So as already mentioned, every specific message in TLS is transmitted in some specific data structures, and in a handshake, alerts, in application data, and all these messages are then wrapped into so-called TLS records. So we have a so-called TLS record layer, and you can imagine TLS record layer as some kind of envelope because we can put there our messages, handshake, application, alerts, and so on, and put them into the put them inside and transmit it. And in case we have established specific keys, we can also close the envelope and transmit all the data securely. So for example, what we can do is if we transmit application data, so we use some HTTP data, so we issue some HTTP GET request. What we do, we put this HTTP data into application message. Application data message is wrapped into a record protocol on the TLS layer and is then sent encrypted or to the TCP layer and to transport layer, which handles our data and transmits it to the server. So this is on a very, very high level how TLS works. So we first wrap the original data on the application layer into some messages or into some data structures. These messages are then put into records, and these records are then sent to the transport layer, and everything is sent securely. We will see in a few minutes how it is done when we will analyze the traffic using Wireshark. So one more thing that I wanted to also mention, what is very, very important for TLS are so-called TLS Cipher Suites. So TLS as a cryptography protocol is, of course, full of crypto. So you use cryptography for establishing keys, for exchanging the data, for encrypting specific application messages, and which algorithms are used in TLS is defined by a so-called TLS Cipher Suite. So a TLS Cipher Suite is a collection of cryptographic algorithms which are used in a TLS session. And they define a TLS Cipher Suite defines a key exchange algorithm, encryption key algorithm, or HMAC algorithm that we use to protect the data. Here is so if there are some system administrators or some of you who have already worked with TLS servers, then you have definitely seen something like this. So this is a TLS Cipher Suite, TLS ECDHE RSA with AES 128 CBC SHA. What does it mean for us? If we see such kind of Cipher Suite, then we know that the Cipher Suite uses elliptic curve ephemeral key exchange for establishing keys in the TLS handshake. If we use Diffie-Hellman, then we need to use signatures, and therefore we use, in this case, RSA. And then after exchanging the data, we need to encrypt the application messages. And for this purpose, we use AES 128 in a cipher block chaining mode of operation. And we need to protect the data authenticity. And for this purpose, we use HMAC SHA for data authentication. So this is just an example of a Cipher Suite. However, there are many of them. Does anybody have an idea how many Cipher Suites are there? So we'll try to get this question. So do you know how many Cipher Suites are there?
Put your guesses in the chat.
To be honest, I do not see the chat now. So I
okay, we have 50, 200, 100, 50, okay. 150, 30. 80.
Okay. So probably the highest possible vote was the most correct one, or Robert?
200 is even not enough.
Yeah, it's not enough. So what I wanted to say is there are many Cipher Suites. So there are Cipher Suites which were defined already in the 90s, also for specific purposes of testing. So for example, there is a Cipher Suite called TLS null with null algorithm. So this means that you are not using any encryption and any authentication. You can use TLS RSA with null, MD5, and so on. There are some export Cipher Suites. So there are over 300 or maybe 400 cipher suites that were defined over the recent years. So you can imagine, only just taking a look at this number of cipher suites, that TLS can become very complex and has a lot of complexity inside.
Yeah, the reason for this is also immediately clear if you think about how many people are actually using TLS, because it's used worldwide across billions of people, and they all have different requirements and different standards they have to appear or comply to. And this is represented by the complexity of the protocol.
Okay. So are there any questions until now? Okay, seems like not to be the case, or? So let us start with TLS 1.2 and with the basic handshake. So until now, we made a very, very basic introduction, high-level introduction to TLS and motivated its usage. And now we would like to get into TLS Handshake and how it works on the high level. So,
yeah. So, as you already mentioned, the handshake is responsible for the negotiation of the cryptographic materials and the cryptographic algorithms. So if you want to start a TLS connection, the client has to send a client hello message to a server, which basically tells the client about the supported cryptographic features of the clients, the highest supported TLS version, and it also sends a cryptographic random number, so-called nonce, which will be used to get, assure that the key material which is established is fresh for the connection. If a server receives such a client hello, he knows that there's a client who wants to establish a TLS connection. So what he can do is he can pass this client hello message, and he can choose the algorithms and the version which he finds suitable for the connection. So for example, if a client proposed a list of algorithms, the server can choose the algorithm he wants to use for the connection. And he does this by sending a server hello message, I think. Okay, he does this by sending a server hello message, in where he chooses the cipher suite, he chooses the version he wants to use, and he also sends a random value to the client, which will also influence the cryptographic computations. After that, the server sends a certificate message, and the certificate contains the certificate chain of a server up to the root certificate authority. So the idea is that the server has to prove its identity, that he is actually the server the client is intending to speak to. So he has to present a public key, which is oftentimes an RSA public key, but it can also be like an ECDSA public key. After that, the server sends a server key exchange message in the famous elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral handshake, which is like the standard which your browser uses every day. And the server key exchange message contains an ephemeral public key. So what the server does is he generates a key which is only used for this connection, and he then signs this key together with a client random and server random with a key with a private key to the certificate. So he proves that he knows the private key which belongs to the certificate, and therefore proves that he is actually indeed the server the client wants to connect to, and sends it to the client together with a server hello done message. And the server hello done message is a message which does not contain much. It only indicates to the client that the server is done talking and it's now time for the client to speak. The client then in return responds with its own client key exchange message. And this client key exchange message contains the public key from the client. So in this case, a Diffie-Hellman public key. After that, both parties can compute a shared secret, a so-called Diffie-Hellman secret, or in TLS, we call this the pre-master secret. And this is a fresh value which is generated only for this session. And since the server key exchange message was authenticated, we have a one-sided authentication. So usually the client does not authenticate towards the server. Once both parties have computed this pre-master secret, they can compute a master secret from this pre-master secret and use this master secret to derive the symmetric keys, which are actually used for the encryption. So at this point, both parties have all the key material they use. They just have to synchronize with each other. So what the client then does is it sends a change cipher spec message. And this change cipher spec message basically tells, okay, server, from now on, you have to decrypt the messages I sent. Every message after this will be encrypted. So you will have to use the keys we just negotiated to decrypt my messages. The client then sends a client finished message, which is basically a cryptographic checksum, which the server can verify to see that an attacker did not influence the other messages so far. So the server that receives this message will decrypt the finished message because it's encrypted. It's sent after the change cipher spec message, and he will check that the checksum is indeed the same checksum he would have computed himself. So, and if he thinks that's the case, then he knows that the previous messages were not manipulated. And he then can continue and send a change cipher spec message himself. So he says, okay, from now on, also my messages will be encrypted. And he confirms this with his finished message himself. So that the client can also confirm that the messages exchanged have not been tampered with so far. And if that is the case, the client can confirm that the finished message is the same that the client would have computed. Both parties can finish the handshake and send application data. And the real application can start.
Okay, so what is interesting here is that the pre-master secret is based always on fresh defilement keys, which are generated by the client and the server. So everything is secure, and both client and server can exchange afterwards the secure application data. I'm sorry, Robert, for the misalignment. I was searching for the messages. So yeah, so this was probably the most complex part of today's talk. So this is the TLS handshake and how it works. And maybe in order to improve our skills or take a look how it works, we wanted to show you how to analyze such TLS handshakes or TLS connections in general using Wireshark. So Wireshark is probably the best tool what you can use for analysis of protocols in general, or analyzing specific connections and so on and so on. And also for the analysis of TLS. So as already mentioned, we prepared for you a virtual machine. This virtual machine, so you can download it now and try to work with us. But in general, you can complete the exercises afterwards. So what we have prepared for you is a specific folder with a specific, I would say, README, which demonstrates what is the organization of the folder and of the virtual machine, which attacks are we going to execute, and so on and so on. So Heartbleed attack or TLS 1.3 specific server authentication bypasses, and so on and so on. And what we have here prepared also is specific TLS libraries like Embed TLS, Wolf SSL, OpenSSL, and so on, so which are compiled, and you can start them using the commands that we have prepared for you. So we will analyze these libraries using Tls-Attacker, so which is our tool that Robert will talk about a bit later. And what we have also here is a specific set of keys that we pre-generated for you in order to play with basic TLS connections. So what I wanted to show you now is the TLS handshake that we talked about in the previous slides. And for this purpose, what I can do, I can go to the folder with the keys, and I would just start an ordinary OpenSSL as server. So OpenSSL is a tool or a library which allows you to implement TLS on your servers, in Apache web servers, in Nginx web servers, and so on and so on. But this library also helps you or provides you a specific set of tools which you can play with and use it for analysis of connections. And for one of these tools is OpenSSL S server, which allows you to to start a specific openness TLS server and with specific keys. So in this case, I have generated 2 keys or 1 key with 1 certificate. And I can start now OpenSSL server on my localhost machine. Now, OpenSSL by default runs on localhost port 4433. And now I can use a client in order to initiate a connection with this server. Before I do this, I will start Wireshark. And so our tool that we want to use for our analysis. And for those of you who do not know Wireshark, don't worry about it. So it's not very complicated to use. So it's just a network sniffing tool, which allows you to take a look at the traffic that goes on the network interface. So in this case, I can select, I want to see all the traffic that is sent over the local host. And what I can do now, there is no traffic yet, but what I can do now, I can start OpenSSL client. So another useful tool, and I can say I want to connect to, I will say 127.2, so that it's a bit. So we can distinguish it, and we will use TLS 1.2. So if I now fire this command, what happens is Wireshark will record a traffic that is sent between the client here and the server that was started in the right terminal. So we can see already in the terminal that we have initiated a TLS 1.2 connection with ECDHE RSA. So that cipher suite that was just presented by Robert, and or using the handshake that was presented by Robert. And we have here some session IDs, some master key. So this is the key that was mentioned by Robert that was used to establish the session. And we have here some other properties. So, but for our purposes, so what is interesting is to take a look at the connection. And okay, this is a bit small, so I hope that it's visible for you. So
you can also press that plus sign on the toolbar. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So now it should be much better. Okay. So we see 11 packages that were transferred over the local host. I can, using this window, I can filter it so that I get much better view on the packets that were transferred. And I can see that there are already some messages that are known for you from the introduction of Robert. And the first one is the client hello message, which I will close this one. This is a byte layer or byte view of the specific packets that were transferred. What we are interested in, if you click on it, we are mostly interested in the analysis of the transport layer. So if I go to the, if I click on client hello and take a look at the transport layer security here, then I will see the record layer. So as already mentioned, every message in the TLS protocol flow is transferred in a so-called TLS record layer, which works as an envelope. So it's just takes the client hello message, puts it inside, and puts there a length of it and the TLS version, and there we have our client hello message. So what we have now is if we click on this one, then we see that there is a client hello message. It has specific lengths, it has a specific version, it has some randomness as mentioned by Robert. So we need some randomness. We have some cipher suites that were proposed by the client. So we have different ECDHE, SCDSA, or ECDHE RSA cipher suites. And we have specific extensions. So I'm not going into details of them, but you have specific extensions inside. Okay, so after sending the client hello message, the server sends a server hello. And the server hello, as introduced by Robert, is also wrapped into a so-called TLS record and contains the TLS version that was selected, then some randomness and the selected cipher suite. It contains also several extensions, and which are currently not in the scope or not so interesting for us. After sending the server hello message, the server sends a certificate message which contains the RSA public key of the server, so that the client knows who it communicates with. And finally, the server sends a server key exchange message with a server hello done messages. So the server key exchange message is probably the most important one, or one of the most important messages, because it contains Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and which in this case we use elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange with the specific X25519 curve and with this public key. And in order to prevent active man-in-the-middle attacks, this public key is also signed using the key from the certificate. Okay, and finally, the server sends a server hello done message. After sending the server hello done message, the client continues with the client key exchange message, which contains only a Diffie-Hellman key exchange value with a public key of the client. Based on the client key exchange and server key exchange messages, specific keys can be derived, and the client then can say change cipher spec, which basically announces. So this is a simple 1-byte message, which just tells. Oh, I will turn this out so that it does not. So TLS change cipher spec message is a 1-byte message which just says, hey, I would like to talk in an encrypted way, so please switch to an encrypted state. And afterwards, everything what is sent is encrypted. So maybe the question for you, for the audience, so what is the content of this encrypted handshake message? So what is, which handshake message is inside? Robert, you need to help me again because I still do not see.
Yeah, there's still no comments to that on the chat. So maybe I repeat the question. So which message could this be? The encrypted handshake message after the CCS message. It's like the test if you listen closely to my explanation before. Is I guess all of them? No? Ah, Jens got it. The finished message, exactly.
Okay, cool. Do you know, Jens, also why is it encrypted handshake message? Why not finished here?
Not sure.
Okay.
So the reason is actually because the change cipher spec message tells the server that the client is now encrypting the message. So the message is actually encrypted, and therefore Wireshark cannot pass the message. So Wireshark does not have the keys to decrypt this message because Wireshark is only observing the communication. So it does not actually know that this is a finished message. We know because we know it's we are speaking TLS protocol, but Wireshark would have to guess. So without having the keys, Wireshark can also, can only guess, and therefore we only see encrypted handshake messages. Can only tell it's a handshake message because of the record layer.
Yeah, so we can see here the content type and the version are not encrypted, and the length of the message, but everything what's inside the handshake message is encrypted. So on the record layer. So as already mentioned in the previous slides, the envelope was closed, and we do not see what's inside now. And yeah, so the server now does the same and basically sends the chain cipherspec and handshake message back. There's a new session ticket message. I'm not going into details of this. So for the handshake, it's interesting for us. So what's inside? So the chain cipherspec and the encrypted message. Okay, so after sending these messages and after exchanging the keys, client and server can communicate in an encrypted way. So I can send as a client some data to the server will retrieve it. So I can send different data again, they will be retrieved. And if I go to Wireshark, then I will see that there is again some new data that were now transferred, application data, and we again can only see the type of the data, so it's application data, but we do not see what's inside. So maybe before I continue or we continue with attacks, then I will show you one trick. So how to analyze secure connection. So and how to decrypt this data. So maybe there will be a specific situations where you would like to get the content of the messages and to decrypt the communication. And this is not possible if you do not have the keys, or if you do not, if you cannot debug the communication from the client side. So what we can do, we can, for example, start the OpenSLS client with a specific parameter, which is called keylog file. And in this case, I will start it with keylog file, keylog log. And what this does is it will start the OpenSLS client the same way as before, but will write all the cryptographic keys and all the cryptographic material inside of a so-called keylog file. So what I can do now, I can go to the application data or to click on any message. I can click on protocol preferences, and I can say remaster secret log file. And in this case, I hope it will work, because sometimes it does not work well. So what I can do now, I can select keys that were stored by OpenSL. It's some kind of public format that or widely used format that is used for storing cryptographic keys or log files for TLS. And if I select it, then Wireshark will be able to see all the data or all the keys that were inside, and we will see that now we are sending not only encrypted handshake messages, but concrete finished messages were sent by the client and by the server, and we can also see the content of the application data. So there is application data. I need to get again to the byte level. So we are here now in the application data, and we click on encrypted application data, and we can see here in the decrypted way, so what I have sent, because Wireshark was able to decrypt it. Okay, so this is the first maybe tool that allows you to analyze TLS and your communication connection. So I hope this is somehow helpful for you if you have some troubles with TLS or with TLS connections in your work. Okay, are there any questions?
Does not look like it. If you have any questions, you can just type it while we speak, and we'll answer them at any given break. So we do not have to stop there.
Robert will notice this and rephrase it, and then we will try to respond.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
So maybe, as you have already heard, the TLS ecosystem is quite complex. There are billions of users. Oh, where's the question? Can we go a bit more detail on the convention of low cipher suites? Is there some specific implementation contract or just informally done? So I'm not sure what you mean with a convention of low cipher suites. So the idea is that the client sends a list which contains the cipher suites, and the list the client sends can be ordered. So the client can say the top cipher suites are his most. Oh, he doesn't mean cipher suite. He means version. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Can you click on the client hello URI, please? I think there was some discussion in the chat. So if you look at this record from the client hello message, you see version TLS 1.0. And if you scroll a little bit below, you see version TLS 1.2. And there was a question in the chat which said, well, what is it, TLS 1.0 or the TLS 1.2? The thing is, the client in the record layer, you would usually send the negotiated protocol version. So if you are in a TLS 1.2 connection, you would send TLS 1.2, or in a TLS 1.1 connection, you would send TLS 1.1. The problem is, at this point, there is no connection yet. So you have not negotiated anything. So the client is not sure what to put in his record on the record layer. In the client hello message, he wants to put his highest version. So he says, this is the highest version I support. In this case, it's TLS 1.2. So the server knows at least TLS 1.2 is supported, maybe some lower versions, but there's no possibility in the client hello message to communicate all the supported versions. So what is that was established by the implementations that they use the record layer of the first client hello message where no version is actually negotiated to communicate the lowest supported version from the client. So in this case, TLS 1.0. So this tells the server, okay, you can assume that I know TLS 1.0 and I know TLS 1.2. So I will probably also know TLS 1.1. There's no assurance that this is the case, so the server has to guess, but usually this works in practice. So I hope this answers the question. Okay. Okay, so as I already said, TLS is a complex protocol, and as you've probably seen, there's a lot of stuff because billions of people want to use TLS in different settings. They want to use it with different application layers. They have different requirements. They want to use it inside banks and so on. And this results in tons of cryptographic primitives which were introduced and tons of extensions, algorithms, and stuff like that. And some of those algorithms are now, from today's perspective, deprecated. So TLS is from 1994, or SSL is from 1994, and we learned a lot about crypto since then. And those algorithms are still somewhat in TLS, so which cause a lot of attacks. There's also some additional complexity because TLS is usually done over TCP, but there's also some applications require a UDP connection. So, for example, if you want to do like a Skype call, for example, you want to transmit your video, but you do not care if the packets actually get dropped. If a packet gets dropped, you would just want to continue. You don't want to do a retransmission. So this can also complicate the protocol. And as I already mentioned, there are tons of extensions. You were skipped over them, but they extended the protocol to fit the specific user needs. For example, the elliptic curves extension was added when they introduced elliptic curve cipher suites, because there you need to communicate the supported groups of a client. Or the server name indication extension was added to support server hosting where multiple TLS servers are hosted on the same port on a single server, and so on and so on. There are also additional public key infrastructure features which were incorporated, and this makes the whole protocol like really, really complex. And this in return resulted in a lot of attacks which followed the different versions. So the first attacks were done by Schneier et al., which attacked SSL2, I think a few months after it was released. So it was already broken. They did the same with SSL version 3, so they came up with some theoretical attacks, but overall the handshake was assumed to be quite secure. And then it was followed by the first major attack on TLS, which had a real-world impact, which is the Bleichmach attack from 1999, which exploits subtle side channels in the handshake, which Juraj will talk about later. And then in 2001, we had padding oracle attacks, but the padding oracle attacks were back then not so really practical, but they showed that there's some general design flaws in TLS. Then there was a long pause. Nobody knew of any attacks on TLS because they were not thinking outside the box. But then came the beast attack and the crime attack, which introduced a new attacker model. So they showed that it's not enough to be secure against active man-in-the-middle attackers. You also have to be secure if the attacker is a man in the browser. So the attacker also has some control over the packets the client sends, which usually happens when you are using HTTP, for example. If you click on an advertisement by the attacker, then the client can execute JavaScript in your browser, and he can force your browser to send some specific requests, which extended the scope of TLS attacks and which created like the golden era of TLS attacks, which lasted till 2016 maybe. There were a lot of research papers and a lot of research on TLS, and we learned a lot about cryptographic protocols. Some of the protocols we now have, they do not only have names, but they also have logos. And this is like a tradition in TLS nowadays. So it makes it a lot easier to talk about these things. So for other products, you often have like these CVEs, and which makes it really annoying if you want to talk about something which affects like all the products. So it's really hard to remember CVE 255618. It's much easier to remember Heartbleed and have this logo so you instantly recognize it. And one of the attacks we want to talk about now is the Heartbleed attack. And maybe you have already heard about this attack because it's like the most famous attack on the TLS, and it actually made it into the German Tagesschau. So it's like the media government news channel. And the Heartbleed attack exploits a specific extension in the TLS ecosystem, which is called the Heartbeat extension. And the Heartbeat extension was designed that if you establish the TLS connection and you want to know if a server or the client you're talking to is still alive, that you can send a Heartbeat request. And the Heartbeat request contains some data, and it contains some language which tells the peer how long the data is. In this case, ESORICS, and it's 7 byte long. And then the server is supposed to respond with a Heartbeat message himself with the same length field and the same data, so that the peer knows that the other one is still alive. And why can an attacker forge that? Well, these messages are usually supposed to be exchanged after the handshake. So the messages are encrypted, so an attacker cannot influence them. However, OpenSSL, like the most prominent TLS implementation, had an implementation flaw. So this is not a problem with a standard, but a very implementation-specific flaw. And that is—
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Robert, please excuse, but I have to interrupt for just 5 seconds. You mentioned Tagesschau.
Yeah.
And you called it the government news. There is no government news. TV programs in Germany are independent from the government.
Yeah, but it's—
We are not, it's the official—
It's government funded, yeah.
No.
It's not funded from the government?
No, you fund it with the 50 euro or 80 euro
Okay.
you pay every few months.
Okay.
And it's the difference between the German, it's public television, but it's definitely, watch how they bash the government. They're not government funded.
Okay.
Okay.
But okay, it's a
But
it's
the most traditional German public television news and the most prestigious place to be mentioned.
Okay.
End of interruption.
Yeah, so I want to say it's important news. That was what I wanted to say. Important news media. So to get back to the Heartbleed attack now. In the Heartbleed attack, the attacker can send maliciously crafted Heartbleed messages, which contain some payload for, in this case, ESORICS, but he lies with the length field. So he does not say, oh, this is 7 bytes, but he says this is like hex 1000 bytes, so really 16,000 or something, a lot of bytes, I don't know. And what happened with this bug on the server side is the server saw this and he responded with a Heartbeat message himself and then sent the same length field, but he did not respond with the ESORICS the attacker sent, but he read over the buffer boundaries internally and started to respond with all the memory contents of the server, or a lot of memory contents from the server. And these memory contents could then be used by the attacker to leak all kinds of session secrets or even the private key of a certificate from the attacker. So very, very bad attack for TLS and a very black day. So what can you do with a heartbeat attack? You can read memory from the server, and that allows you to steal the private key, and with that, dramatically consequences. So what had to be done is they had to exchange all the private keys and all the certificates of basically, I think 70% or something of all the servers on the internet. And this bug was undetected for 3 years. So there was a huge window where attackers could have exploited this attack without anybody noticing. And the thing is, it's also very hard to notice this attack from the outside because the application does not crash. And the payload is encrypted, so your firewall also would have to decrypt the packets, which made it very, very hard to find any real-world exploitation before that.
Okay, so as already mentioned by Robert, so this was only a bug in OpenSSL, but since OpenSSL is the major library that we use on the internet, so by basically about 80% of the servers, then it was had a very huge impact. So this was just an example. So what can go wrong in a specific implementation if you use specific extensions? What we also wanted to talk about is a different attack called robot. Before that, I would like to introduce a term, or maybe it was also mentioned by Robert, the term side channel attacks. Does anybody know what happened here? Can anybody tell me what happened here? Any idea? Robert, you are following the chat, yeah?
Yeah, so Alex suggests growing wheat, crypto mining. Yeah. And if you also says crypto mining, growing something.
Yeah. So actually, it's maybe the question could be answered also with the location. So it indeed happened in Netherlands, and this was a specific case where a police department found a person who was growing a wheat in his or her apartment, and they found it using this melted snow. So they basically used a side channel. So they saw the melted snow on the top of the roof, and so that there's probably something fishy going inside, and they were able to arrest this person. So this is a so-called a kind of side channel that they used. In cryptography or in software development, a side channel has also some similar consequences or similar motivations. So it's every attack that exploits indirect implementation information. So for example, error messages in case of TLS alerts, some timing behavior, cache behavior, or some message length that is shown to the attacker. And one of these attacks, there were many attacks on TLS of this sort, but one of this was Robot, which was our attack back in 2018, which stands for Return of Bleichenbacher's Oracle Threat. And it was a work together with Hanno Böck and Craig Young that I performed in 2018. And the main idea of the attack was to apply Bleichenbacher's attack against widely used servers and test whether they are still vulnerable to this attack. So as mentioned by Robert, Bleichenbacher's attack was published in 1998. It was the first serious cryptographic attack that was published in the era of SSL TLS. And it is a so-called adaptive chosen ciphertext attack, which is based on a weakness in RSA PKCs 1.5. It works as follows. So imagine that we have a client which sends ciphertext to the server. We have an attacker who eavesdrops this ciphertext and uses a server as an oracle. These attacks are also called oracle attacks or padding oracle attacks. Why is this the case? Because the attacker takes the ciphertext. The attacker does not have any information about it, but the attacker can do some meaningful modifications to the ciphertext, modify it, send it to the server, use it as an oracle, and the oracle will respond with valid or invalid. This will be repeated several times with different ciphertext, and at the end, the attacker is able to decrypt the ciphertext and thus get the plaintext communication. So this is a very general idea of the attack. We are not going to the details and how this crypto behind this works. But what is important for TLS maybe is that how Bleichenbacher's attack is applicable to TLS. So Bleichenbacher's attack is applicable to TLS in a way that the attacker takes a specific message or ciphertext, inserts it into the client key exchange message, modifies it, and sends this client key exchange message or the handshake, that executes the handshake with the server. And if the server responds, for example, with different alert messages with decryption error, bad record make, and so on, then the attacker can get some useful information. And after a few thousands or millions of queries, the attacker can decrypt the ciphertext. Okay, so what we did in 2018, we found out that 2.8% of Alex out of 1 million servers were vulnerable. So for example, PayPal, Apple, eBay, Cisco, and so on and so on. And from scientific perspective, which was quite interesting, was that we got several different error messages or different behaviors of different servers. So for example, instead of alerts, we get different behaviors when the servers responded with TCP connection resets or with some timeouts, or we retrieved different alert messages, or we retrieved the same alert messages which were returned by the server, but in one case, in case the message was, for example, valid, or then we retrieved only one alert, in the other case, 2 alerts. So this shows how important or how complex could be to analyze these kind of attacks, these kind of side channel attacks. And Bleichenbacher's or million message attack or the robot attack are just examples. So for example, there are other related side channel attacks. So you can execute adaptive chosen padding oracle attacks against cipher blockchaining mode of operation. So maybe you've heard of CBC padding oracle vulnerability. So this is also what you can exploit in the area of TLS. Maybe you've heard of Lucky 13 attack, or what you could do, you could exploit different responses from the servers, not only the differences in the messages or differences in the connection states, but also timing differences when the messages arrive from the server. So imagine that you send a specific message to the server, and depending on the decryption state, one message is responded earlier than the other. So there was a tutorial by Michael Schwartz, so he already talked a lot about these kind of side channel attacks. So these are also applicable to TLS. Okay, so this was just a motivation for the next lecture or next part of the lecture, which we'll talking about TLS 1.3. For now, do you have any questions?
So I do not see any questions in the chat yet, but maybe as an anecdote, so if you were in 2018 and you got friends like I have, which ask you, can you hack my ex-girlfriend's Facebook account? With a robot attack, you could have actually done that. So Facebook was also vulnerable, and you can actually could have used that to decrypt Facebook connections and steal the username and passwords, and then yeah, steal their Facebook. So it's a very, very powerful attack in the real world.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Robert. Okay. So let's talk now about TLS 1.3. And for now, I'm not sure. Did you want to talk about it, or should I start?
Sure, let me talk about it. So in in 2008, 2009 was the last version TLS 1.2 established. And then came the wave of cryptographic attacks. So when the community decided that it's time to fix something, but because up to 2016, 2015 or something like that, they only added new extensions and only deprecated features. So they said, oh, you cannot use this anymore, you should not use that anymore, or please use this extension, otherwise you're vulnerable. And someday they said, okay, we need a new version which fixes all these problems. We're not happy with the current state anymore. And they announced that they are working on TLS 1.3. And TLS 1.3 had two major design motivations. So the first one is we wanted, or maybe worst one is we wanted to get rid of all these attacks. That's maybe the most one. But there are also two other important things. So they've also wanted to design a protocol from scratch, and we wanted to design a faster protocol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our goal is to for now to learn about TLS 1.3. So we already know now how TLS 1.2 somehow works, how the handshake works, how specific attacks work. So these are also important for the developments of TLS 1.3. And now we want to understand how TLS 1.3 really was designed, what were the design decisions, how we can develop TLS 1.3 from the protocol flow that we used in TLS 1.2, and what were the deployment problems maybe. So Robert will talk about specific incompatibilities issues and so on and so on. And TLS 1.3 so is a result of 5 years of hard design and development process that we have seen in the cryptographic community. Okay.
Yeah, I see I was getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, it's hard to somehow synchronize.
Yeah,
this, so.
Yeah. So as I already said, they started the design from scratch. So they established a new handshake protocol, where basically they changed the message order and they changed the meaning of some of the messages. And they did not only add stuff on top of it. And the number one motivation was to have a faster handshake. So if you imagine you are Google and you have like 1 million servers in your basement, then if your connections are 5% faster, then you need 5% less servers. And 5% less servers from 1 million is a lot of servers. So it's really nice if you can improve on the speed. And also it shows, there's some studies on it, that if your connections to your online shop are faster, that you do more sales. So if your connection is slow, people will just click away. So it's also nice to have a faster connection. So this is a repetition of a TLS 1.2 handshake, and we already talked about this, like the general shape. For TLS 1.3, they changed it completely up. So this is how it looks in TLS 1.3. And I will go briefly over it. So the handshake starts again with the client hello. So the client proposes all its algorithms, and the server chooses the algorithms, but the client also includes more information. Like he includes a specific extension which contains the client's public key. So the client actually guesses the public key, the public key group the server will be using, and transmits it immediately. The server also sends the public key with the server hello messages, so they both can encrypt from the start. Then there's some encrypted extension message, and then the authentication step takes place. And then we see this finished messages again, and the client also sends the finished message. And what you can see is that this requires less message exchanges. So for the previous handshake, we need like 2 flights, and now we only need 1 flight and a bit. So, yeah, so much faster.
So starting with here, you can already exchange your application data like HTTP GET request. And this can only be done after 2 round trips. So this is 1 round trip until you retrieve the server hello done. Then there is a 2nd round trip until you receive the server finished message. And this is too slow. So for this purpose, TLS 1.3 was improved, and you can see that already with the 2nd round trip, you can send the application data. Okay. And so the next improvement, as already mentioned by Robert, was that TLS 1.3 should prevent all the attacks that were previously discussed in the community, in the cryptographic community.
Exactly. So, for example, we wanted to get rid of Bleichenbacher attacks, we want to get rid of padding oracle attacks, and we also want to get rid of all this old crypto, like from the 90s, like single DES, MD5, RC4, like all the stuff which the community learned was had bad design decisions. We're going to get rid of these completely. And we also want to get rid of places where implementations can design or can choose a weak parameter. So basically what you want with TLS 1.3, that every connection is secure up to today's standard, no matter what algorithms you choose.
Yeah, so basically what TLS 1.3 did is in order to prevent Bleichenbacher's attack, they completely disabled TLS RSA algorithm. So you will see RSA inside of TLS 1.3, but only for signing. No encryption is performed in TLS 1.3 using RSA because this made the protocol vulnerable to Bleichenbacher's attacks. We already mentioned the CBC padding oracle attacks, and for this purpose of resurrecting and always returning CBC padding oracle attacks, all the CBC Cipher Suites were disabled. And as mentioned by Robert, there are still many Cipher Suites that were using old, outdated cryptographic primitives like triple DES, or RC4 and so on, and all these were disabled. And what also was a huge problem in specific implementations was that they used some customly defined Diffie-Hellman groups. And if you are coming from the crypto area, then you have maybe heard that defining Diffie-Hellman groups or finite fields, or generating them could be hard. And this was also the case in several libraries, as they used specific very insecure groups that allowed for further attacks. And therefore, the designers decided, no, we are not going to allow this, and we are only using standardized elliptic curve or Diffie-Hellman groups or finite fields, and so that nobody can do mistakes. Okay, so this led to the design of TLS 1.3. So it was a development, so more than 4 years development effort, which was then published in 2018. It was provably secure, verified, and it's completely changed the protocol messages that were inside. So there are new messages, extensions, protocol flows. There is also zero RTT mode that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And a lot of new what happened in the recent years that tried to improve the state of the TLS ecosystem. Maybe there is one anecdote, so maybe about TLS versions. Robert, do you want?
Yeah, sure. So the SSL version scheme is kind of cursed. So when SSL 2 was designed in the 90s, they gave it the version number 0200. And when they added SSL 3, they just updated the version number to 0300. So SSL 3, 0300, that makes sense. But when they renamed the protocol to TLS 1.0, they did not choose a completely new version number, but what they did instead is they incremented the version number to 0301. So basically TLS 1.0 is SSL version 3.1. Then, when they introduced new versions like TLS 1.1 and TLS 1.2, they just kept incrementing the version, so that TLS 1.2 doesn't have a version 1.0.2 or something. It has the version 0303. And when they designed TLS 1.3, we were not sure in the beginning which version number it should have. Like, should it be TLS 2.0? Should it be TLS 4? Or should it be TLS 3? There were many guesses and many discussions on the mailing group. So for the draft versions, they gave it the version number 7F and then some identifiers. So we were not sure which version it will end up with. But with TS103, we ended up with, as you know now, with TS103. But could you guess the version number? Is it any guesses in the chat? 03031, no. But also good guess, could be completely fine. 0303, also good guess. We will talk about that later.
Yeah, that's a good guess.
1337, also nice. Okay, dead beef. No, what? all good guesses. But what they did is they just incremented it. So TS103 has version number 0304. So I would have preferred if we would have just swapped to TS 4.0 or 2.0 or something like that and not kept going with this, because TS103 will change the protocol enormously, and it's kind of misleading that it's only a minor version bump. But this is where we are.
If you go back to 2016-17, you will see a lot of blog posts, but mailing list discussions on this topic and how they think about this numbering. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what we wanted to do now is to introduce TLS. So Robert already somehow showed how TLS 1.3 works, but we promised that we will build up TLS 1.3 on top of TLS 1.2. So you already know somehow how TLS 1.2 works, and we will try to improve it. So from the previous slides, you know that if we use TLS 1.2, then we send the client hello message, then we retrieve server hello, certificate, server key exchange, and server hello done. And then what is needed to be done, the client key exchange is sent. So by Tessa, and then after we have sent this client key exchange message, then we can compute all the pre-master secrets and all the secrets that are inside of the computations that are used for the encryption mechanisms, and we can send the change cipherspec message and finish messages to announce that we are communicating securely now. And the server does the same, and now we can exchange application messages. So now if you take a look at this protocol flow, we can see that the client, after sending a client hello message, it waits for the server key exchange message in order to send a Diffie-Hellman key exchange or Diffie-Hellman key exchange part. My question is now, does the client need to wait for the server key exchange message? What does the client need to send the client key exchange? So maybe for some of you who are cryptographers, maybe you could guess, so is it the server certificate? Is it the server public key from the server key exchange, or are these only the server group parameters? What do you think? So what does the client need to do in order to send the client key exchange message? Any guesses in the chat?
Ali guesses free, or says free.
Yes, actually, yes. Yes, so basically, in order to send a Diffie-Hellman key share, you do not need to wait for the concrete public key from the server. You just need to know which parameters the server uses. So for example, it uses some specific elliptic curves, it uses specific Diffie-Hellman groups, and so on. And there are, I would say, a handful or maybe a bit more group parameters that can be supported by the server. And therefore, what the client can do, it can just guess that the server probably uses these group parameters, so it can send the client key exchange message or with the public key or together with the client hello message. So we move the client key exchange message to the client hello now. So now, since we moved the client key exchange here, the server now has the client key exchange, it has the server key exchange, so it was already able to compute the whole cryptographic material here in this place. So all the secrets can be computed based on server key exchange and client key exchange messages. So based on this, we can also move change cipherspec and finish messages to the top. and they can be sent already with the first response of the server. Since the client can now retrieve or the finished message from the server, it can send the application data directly with the second flight. And what is also possible is to send the application data already in the first flight from the server. This is not that common, but it is also possible. So basically what we did, we moved the client key exchange, or we guess the public key or the parameters from the server. We send the public key here in the client directly with the client hello message, and this way we improved the latency of the TLS 1.3 handshake, so that it can the keys can be computed either directly after sending the server key exchange message. So what's happened also is this client key exchange and server key exchange messages were removed. So they were sent now as extensions, as already mentioned by Robert. So directly with the client hello and server hello messages, there are extensions which are sent, which notify or which contain the public keys of the client and of the server. So this is the final protocol flow. So we have client hello with the public key of the client, server hello with the public key of the server. We have encrypted extensions, so the server can also include encrypted extensions inside. So because with this message, everything is already encrypted. We have a certificate, which is also encrypted as well. We have certificate verify, which signs the wall previous messages, and afterwards we can send finished and application data directly. So
okay,
this, yeah.
There's a question in the chat, and that is, how many guesses does the client make in its client key exchange message? So the message is now in the client hello, so it's actually in the client hello message, but this entirely depends on the client. So the client can decide how many guesses it includes. It can include arbitrary many. The thing is, there's a trade-off. If you include too many, your client hello becomes too big, and then the transmissions may become slower. So what they usually do is they include one or two, usually one, and they hope for the best. And if it doesn't work, then they can do a hello retry message exchange where they guess again, or they choose again.
So if you choose a wrong group that is not supported by the server is responds with a specific message, and then you retry this. So as a cryptographer, you have definitely heard of specific groups like NIST 256 elliptic curve groups, or Edward curves. These are very common groups that are supported by many servers. So if you send it with the client hello message, then you are nearly sure that your server will support them, and you have no troubles. Okay. So what we have seen is that the TLS 1.3 now uses the client key share extension to send client key exchange messages or server key exchange messages. Then here the client guesses the groups that the server supports, and there could be, as was mentioned by Robert, multiple key shares inside of these extensions can be sent. So if you're not sure, you can send 2 or 3 key shares, and one of them will be definitely supported by the server. Okay, so this is already what I mentioned. So certificate verify message is here to sign all the previous messages, and it signs the messages. So in order to prove that the server is indeed the server that holds the key from the certificate. So it's constructed based on the previously sent messages, and is sent after sending the certificate message. Okay, so again, as in the previous case, I would like to show a short demo with TLS 1.3. So I will now switch again to my virtual machine, and show you a demo with TLS 103. So I have still this running server, which is supported by OpenSSL. And what I would like to do is to use TLS 1.3 now. So this is the default case in OpenSSL. So if I establish a connection with OpenSSL S client and connect to the server, then per default, I will retrieve a TLS 1.3 connection. And there is TLS AES GCM, which was established. So this is a specific cipher suite. And what I have not mentioned maybe in the slides is that there are no elliptic curve or no key exchange algorithms in the cipher suites. In TLS 1.3 cipher suites, all this data were omitted because we use only Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So in TLS cipher suites, TLS 1.3 cipher suites, only the symmetric algorithms are included. Okay, but now let us analyze the Wireshark trace. So what we can see here, okay, extended this, I will put this down so that, okay. So we can see here a TLS 1.3 client hello message, and we can see that there is indeed TLS 1.3 mentioned in the protocol, so Wireshark knows that it is TLS 1.3 handshake message. We can see that there is a record layer which says that it's TLS 1.0, and it includes the handshake client hello protocol. So 1.0, as explained by Robert, is normal because the OpenSSL S client or typical clients send the minimal version of the supported protocol inside of the TLS record. Okay, so let's go to the client hello message. And in the client hello message, we have the client hello indication, the length, and we can see that there is the TLS 1.2 version. So instead of using TLS 1.3, we have TLS 1.2 inside. Okay, so this is interesting. We have here some cipher suites. So cipher suites contain also TLS AES Cha-Cha, TLS AES GCM, TLS Cha-Cha. Okay. So this is something. So there are TLS 1.3, but also TLS 1.2 cipher suites, but there is version indication is somehow incorrect. So this is strange. We have here the key share extension that I talked about. So this is this seems to be like a TLS 1.3 protocol, which seems to be correct. X25519 group, okay, but still I don't know what's here. So let's analyze server hello. So maybe there is something different. So there is server hello message. There is change cipher space and application data. Okay, this is very, very fishy. So we have server hello, change cipher space. I have not shown change cipher space on the slides, and I have not talked about application data. This is strange. So let's talk about TLS 1.3 in server hello message. So let's hope to see it here. And if we analyze the TLS version, then in the TLS record, we have again TLS 1.2. And in the TLS 1.2, in the server hello, we have again TLS 1.2 version. So even though Wireshark thinks that we are using TLS 1.3, there is something fishy going on. So, okay, so let's analyze this. So what we have seen until now, or what we have expected, is something like this. So we wanted to talk TLS 1.3, so we would expect to have 0304 in the TLS record, or we would expect to have 0304 in the client hello message. But instead, we saw TLS 1.0 and TLS 1.2. Okay, so what's going on? So this is the part of Robert. So who will explain what was the problem of compatibilities?
So the core problem is that when they wanted to introduce TLS 1.3, they had to fight backwards compatibility issues. So the problem is they very rarely released new TLS versions. So there was like a 10-year gap. So the implementations were not expecting newer versions than 0303. So what happened is that some servers which did not know TLS 103, if you sent them a client hello message, which would have a correct version for 0304, they would answer with a handshake failure, and they would not fall back to the otherwise perfectly fine version TLS 102, which they should. They aborted the connection completely. And this resulted in the fact that the clients could not send this version field, otherwise it would risk that the connection could not be established and the service would not be working. And this bug is also known as version intolerance. So there are also other intolerances in the TLS protocol where specific implementations are not happy with new values they do not know. But if you would want to solve this on the server side, it's actually not enough. So you could say, okay, we just patch the service and everything is fine. Sadly, this does not work. And I will now show you an example why this is the case. So in real network scenarios, we have middle boxes like firewalls or TLS accelerators or intrusion detection systems, and they also inspect the traffic. So if you send them a client hello message, which contains a version field they do not know, they oftentimes reject this because they do not understand what the 0304 is. And therefore, they do not pass this message to the server. So even if a server is speaking TLS 103, the firewall or the intrusion detection system might block this client hello message so that it does not get forwarded to the server and no connection could be established. So there were many possible solutions on how to tackle this problem. So one problem would be to wait till everyone just fixes their bugs and then we can use the version field again and everything would work fine. The problem is that this could potentially take a very long time. So when TLS 102 was introduced in 2008, 2009, it took, I think, 5 years till it entered into the browsers. And they do not want to wait so long with TLS 103. So this was not an option. They wanted to have something which works now. Another solution would be to ignore this. So just update your browsers and send 0304 in your client hello message. The problem is with that is that your browser now cannot connect to some websites. And usually the last thing which breaks the connection gets the responsibility for that. So if you update your browser, your new Chrome, and it now breaks some of your favorite websites, you will blame Chrome for the bug, while actually the bug is on the server you are connecting to. So this was also not very nice solutions for browsers. So what they ended up doing is they moved the protocol versions, the client supports, to an extension where the servers which would understand TLS 103, they would know that this extension is there, they would know what this extension means, and then they could speak TLS 103. This was the plan.
So there is also a very nice talk from David Benjamin, who is the main developer of Boric SSL at Google, and we talked at Real World Crypto in 2018 about specific problems that they had with the deployment or development of their browsers and what kind of troubles they found. Okay, so as mentioned by Robert, this was the solution to the problem. So the solution was just to send the supported versions inside of the extensions. And if you take a look at the data again and the client hello message, then we will see that there are specific extensions, supported groups, session ticket, blah, 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 supported version extensions. And in these supported extensions versions is the versions are the versions that are supported by the TLS client. And this way, the server doesn't know what the client supports, and they can establish a TLS 103 connection. So as you can see, only Wireshark does understand this solution.
Okay, so if we go back to our example where we have this firewall or intrusion detection system, which blocks our client hello messages where we just set the version field, Now we basically wink in our client hello. We tell, oh, if you speak TLS-103, this is actually a TLS-103 client hello. But if you do not speak TLS-103, this is a TLS-102 client hello. So that we basically trick the other implementation. So that it lets us through. And if a TLS-102 server now receives our client hello message and he does not speak TLS-103, he can perfectly fine ignore the extension and speak TLS-102, and everything works perfectly well. So the problem is solved, right? Well, when a TLS-103 server now behind a firewall receives this, he speaks TLS-103, so he can select TLS-103, right? Well, not exactly. If he chooses TLS-103 in his server hello version, this does not actually work because the firewall sees this version which it does not recognize the 0304 in the server hello, and it will therefore block this server hello and will not let it through the client. So the client speaks TLS-103 and knows what's going on. The server speaks 103, so he knows what's going on. But the firewall does not speak TLS-103, so it does not let this message through. So the obvious solution to that is we move the selected version also in this extension field. So the server is also basically winking to the client, oh, it's actually a TLS-103 connection. And also sends it an extension so that any firewall or alt intrusion detection system which would otherwise block this connection would let this through. So now the firewall is happy because it thinks it's TLS-102 and everything is fine.
Yeah, so if you take a look again at the server hello message, then we can take a look at the extensions. So there is the key share extension and there is the supported version extensions. Even for the server tells us that it uses TLS-102 in the server hello message, then there is this extension which overrides basically this decision and notifies the client, hey, we are indeed using TLS-103 and not TLS-102. Okay, so this was, I would say, quite easy. Maybe not that much by the deployment, but could have been somehow done. But there were other dirty tricks that were done by the developers, by the standardizations. So, for example, we talked about this hello retry request messages, which asks the client to resend specific parameters or in the client key share message. There were additional chain cipherspec messages that were inside. And for example, the TLS-103 handshake is in general hidden as a TLS-102 session resumption in order to protect from these problems with middle boxes. So it was not that easy in general to deploy this protocol, but somehow it worked.
Yeah, maybe also a comment from my side. So these changes are quite weird if you look at them from the outside. And it was mostly done to deploy TLS-103 today. So they wanted to specify it and was actually basically released from the browsers the day the RFC was made public. You could immediately use it. And it saved them a lot of money. But in the end, I think we paid this with a really complex protocol which has all these weird artifacts which do not make a lot of sense. And there's some questions in the chat, so maybe I read them out and Juraj, you can answer. So Bernd asked, what about Quick, where we switch from TCP to UDP, but only can use TLS-103? Still starting with version different from 0304?
To be honest, I do not know if how Quick is implemented. It was now standardized, but I'm not sure in how they use it in the version. Do you know it, Robert?
No, I don't know either, but I would assume that they just use a TLS stack as it is and that they do not modify it, but I actually do not know. There's another question from Alexander. Didn't the version conflicts occur during the migration of earlier TLS versions from TLS-101 to TLS-102?
So this was actually attempted to somehow to prevent. So I would guess that this was the best solution that could be done, and was extensively discussed by the talk of David Benjamin at Real World Crypto. But if you take a look at TLS specs, which do not understand extend, or which do not understand TLS 1.3, what they would do, they would simple servers which would retrieve such a client hello message. It would typically take a look at the client hello version, and it would say, okay, this is TLS 1.2, and it would respond with a TLS 1.2 server hello message. And why is this possible? Why is this not a problem? Because most of the servers do not care a lot about extensions. There are many, many extensions, and if they do not understand it, they ignore them. So in this case, the server which speaks TLS 1.2 only, or lower versions, they would say, oh, there is some signature versions, there's some supported version extensions. I do not understand this extension, so I will ignore it. And then it will also ignore this TLS 1.3 supported version, and it will just speak TLS 1.2. So I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, to get back to the direct question. So when they switched from TLS 1.1 to 1.2, there was not such a big gap between there, and the implementations actually haven't implemented TLS 1.1 yet. So, and TLS 1.1 and 1.2 are not so different to each other. So that worked mostly well. But the switch from TLS 1.0 and 1.2, or 1.0 and 1.1, also caused the same issues. And they wanted to avoid these issues with TLS 1.3, and therefore they preemptively did all those changes and tested the deployments beforehand.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the versions discussion. So I responded to the question for TLS 1.3. Okay. Okay, so maybe one more thing I wanted to show is now we see here server hello, chain cipher spec, and application data. So there are a lot of application data, which is somehow incorrect. But what happens in TLS 1.3, the developers also decided to protect privacy a bit more. So they decided to mask every single message as application data message. Even though it is a handshake message, they decided to send it as an application data. So directly after sending the encrypted data, after sending the chain cipher spec, or after sending the first message that could have been encrypted, they sent everything in the application data in an encrypted way. So in order to analyze it, so let's take a look at it again at our keylog file. So I just wanted to show you. So this does not make much sense to analyze it in this way, because we only see some application data messages. And what we can do again is to run OpenSSL S client with the keylog file. Keylog file is now constructed in a way that is configured for Wireshark. So if I establish a handshake again with the keylog file, and it will be TLS 1.3 handshake, send some messages, then I hope that I will see again. Okay, it works. So live demos work. That's good. So what I can see now is indeed that I see real messages. So what I see here is the server hello message, followed by chain cipher spec and encrypted extensions. Then we have certificate, verify, and finish message. And the client now sends chain cipher spec and finish message. There are session ticket messages. I will omit them again, so these are not that important. But we have application data again. So this application data could be sent directly after this finish message, so directly in the second round trip. But you can see that with this decryption, it is possible to decode the messages. We can see there is a server hello. You can see that chain cipher spec. There is encrypted extensions, which allows us to send specific extensions in a protected way. Then we have certificate, which is in this case, so in the TLS 1.3 case, it's encrypted. So maybe it's also from privacy perspective, this is a very good choice that we have encrypted certificates. And then we have a certificate verify message, which basically is contains a signature over all previous messages that were sent, so that the client can validate the authenticity of the server. And finally, we have the finished message, which contains the so-called verify data over the previous messages. The client now sends a change suffering and finished message, and this confirms the authenticity, or that the client knows the established keys. And finally, application data can be exchanged. Okay. Is there anything what I forgot, Robert?
No, I think we are perfectly fine.
Okay. Or are there any questions that I'm able to see?
No, there are no questions.
Okay. Good. So what we promised you was also zero RTT, and so Robert, maybe do you want to take over? So
sure.
I talked a lot about this Wireshark stuff and so on, and I will introduce it in a few minutes.
So when we introduced TS-103, we also thought it might be possible to send application data already with a client hello, the so-called zero RTT handshake, because you're already sending application data before you actually negotiated the keys. And they had some different approaches to this in the development of TS-103, but we ended up with this pre-shared key zero RTT mode, where the client, if he has already established a connection before, he can use the secrets from the previous connection to already send application data with a new connection. So he can basically be even faster with his connection. It's also called the so-called early data. And it's encrypted with early traffic keys, which are derived from the previous shared secret of a previous connection. If you do not, if you didn't have a previous connection, you cannot use this, or if you do not have a pre-shared key, you cannot use this mode in TS-103. And if a server still remembers this previous session, so he still has this in the cache, or he still has a session ticket from a previous connection, he can derive the same early traffic secret keys, decrypt the application data, and immediately use it. The problem with that is that the application data is secured under old keys, and usually the server does not want to memorize these keys. Oh, so here's another depiction of a zero RTT handshake. So the early application data is transmitted as early data, and the server confirms with the early data extension that he actually has the old key, so that he can actually read the early application data, and the client then sends an end of early application data message, or end of early data message, which gives the server an indication of when the next messages start. So this is quite faster than normal handshake, but the problem is that this construction is vulnerable to replay attacks. So you should not use this with all the different applications. So you should only use this in an application where this is safe. So this is a design decision by the standardization committee that the early application data is not replay protected.
Yeah, so to show you how this works, we can also use OpenSSL and Wireshark. So what I can do now, I can again go to my virtual machine, and you can do this as well. You have the commands here inside. There was some copy of and paste error, so maybe you will get, maybe there was some formatting error, so maybe you will get some troubles on the command line. So please be aware if you are executing these attacks or these protocol flows with our virtual machine. But basically, what you need to do, I will start it. So I need to start the server again. And I need to add a specific parameter which says that the server supports yearly data. So you need to explicitly configure this in OpenSLS server. Now, what I can do as client, I first need to somehow establish a specific session. And for this session, I will remember the keys that I have used. In this case, I can use this using the session out parameter, where I store the data about the keys in a specific file called session cache. What I can do then, I can define my early data. So I have here, I will define some early data. Inside of a file, and now what I can do using the old session and using my OpenSLS client, I can send the yearly data to the server. So what I can do using OpenSLS client, I will close this. Using OpenSLS client, I will connect again using the established session cache with yearly data coming from yearly.data file, and everything will be logged into keylog log file. And if I establish the connection, I can see that the server established the connection and retrieved some data. What I can see now in the handshake is that we have here the client hello message, and the client hello message contains, oh, does it contain early data? I'm wrong now.
You got the wrong client hello.
That's correct. And therefore, thank you. That's good that we have two eyes always. Now pretty confused already with so many handshakes. Okay. So what you can see here, we have a client hello message, which is followed directly by chain cipher spec and application data. And this application data is the 0 RTT application data that was sent by the server, by the client, I'm sorry, and contains the data that I had in my file. How can I know as a client that the data was accepted? I can see in the server hello message. I can see in the server hello message that, sorry.
On top.
No. Supported version, keyshare.
It's an
okay, so it will be probably transferred in the encrypted extensions message. Is it correct?
Yeah, you can do it also in the server hello, I think, but I think you can choose.
I have keylog lock. I've probably mistyped the keylog file. So let's see if okay, it's here. So there's server hello encrypted extensions. And if I take a look at the encrypted extensions message, which is here, I will see that there is an encrypted extension or encrypted extension called yearly data. And this yearly data is of length 0, but it tells us that the server accepted this data. And the client then can send end of yearly data message, which is a very simple message again of length 0, and continue the handshake with a finished message, and so on and so on. And at the end, both can exchange the data. Okay.
There's a question in the chat from Alexander. He asked, but doesn't reusing of old keys introduce Bleichenbacher all over again?
Okay, so in order to introduce Bleichenbacher's attack, so you are probably talking about the million message attack. For this purpose, you need to have a server. The prerequisite is that you have a server which decrypts RSA ciphertexts. And since here we are just transmitting data using symmetrically encrypted cryptographic mechanisms from the previous sessions, you are not using RSA encryption. And therefore, there is no Bleichenbacher attack or oracle that can be established using this zero RTT communication. So I hope this answers the question. So maybe there were different forms of Bleichenbacher attacks, also on RSA signatures and so on, but I am not aware of the fact that they could be introduced by using zero RTT.
There's a follow-up, when not Bleichenbacher specifically, but any other oracle attacks?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what you basically would do, you would take zero RTT data, you would send it to the server, and since the server has no session state, it would respond you somehow with valid or invalid, and you could do it several times because of modifications of early data. That's a very good idea. The problem with for the attacker is that in TLS 1.3 we use only secure cipher suites. So for this purpose, you would need to have a cipher suite, for example, or cipher that uses AES-CBC or maybe RSA or something like this. But since we are using only AES-GCM, which is a secure cryptographic primitive, or Chacha-Poly, which is also secure, these primitives are not vulnerable to the attacks, so we don't have to care about padding oracle attacks or similar attacks. Yeah. But a good idea. Okay. So, are there any questions, Robert?
No other questions.
Okay, so I will just motivate TLS Attacker, and then you'll take over, I would say. Yep. Okay, so for now, we talked about TLS 1.3 and how it works, and we talked about specific attacks, and we made the first analysis of the TLS handshakes using TLS Wireshark traces. And this is quite cool. But the recent developments of TLS ecosystems or of implementations have shown us that there are different problems that can arise when using cryptographic primitives or using cryptographic implementations. So we already talked about heartbleed attacks, where there is a specific buffer overread, which allows you to read arbitrary bytes out of the memory. There are Bleichenbacher's attacks, which allow you to somehow establish oracles based on different error messages, based on different behaviors of the servers, and so on and so on. And there is a lot of more. So there are not only cryptographic side channel attacks or buffer overflows, there are attacks like Suite 32, early CCS, triple handshakes, SMAC TLS attacks, or recently our Raccoon or Alpaca attacks. And all these attacks add more complexity to the whole protocol behavior, not only for TLS 1.2, but also for TLS 1.3. And as security researchers, we talked about it, and we thought about how can we test all these attacks and what can we do in order to improve our skills and make practical tests of TLS implementations, not only TLS 1.2, but also TLS 1.3 and others. Okay.
So maybe the biggest problem with TLS analysis is that the TLS messages are not in ASCII. So for example, if you are doing cross-site scripting or HTTP stuff, it's all in ASCII, and you can basically use an editor to write your messages. But with TLS, this is not so simple because the messages are binary encoded, and then they also depend upon each other. So the contents of your finished message heavily depend on the answer from the server. So you need something which dynamically is able to respond to the different values. So, and what we need from a framework which sends those messages is that we can dynamically change the protocol flow definition, so that we can exchange the message order, or that we can drop some message or add additional messages that should not be there, and that we have flexibility on that side. Additionally, we would want to be able to manipulate the messages. So for example, for the heartbeat attack, we had to send an invalid heartbeat message to trigger the exploit. So as an attacker, we also want to be able to modify the contents of the messages to maybe trigger the different attacks. Also, we want to notice if invalid behavior is triggered. So for example, if a server does something it is not supposed to do, or if a client does something it should not do, we would want to notice. And it's also very important that we can reproduce the findings. So for example, if we found a vulnerability where we found a sequence of messages with specific contents which trigger a bug, it is important that we have a means to communicate that to, for example, the OpenMS developers, such a that they can reproduce the issue and fix the issue on their part.
So I will maybe rephrase this. So based on the slides, because it was hard to follow and so on with the slides, sorry. So you need a tool which flexibly defines the protocol flow so that you can somehow duplicate, remove, or add new messages. You could execute flexible modifications inside of the heartbeat or application message before they are encrypted. And you need to detect the wall behavior and reproduce it. And for this purpose, we designed TLS-Attacker.
Yes, and TLS-Attacker is a flexible framework which allows you to do all these kinds of analysis. And we used it successfully for fuzzing, for testing, to write scanners which can evaluate the configuration or the vulnerabilities of a TLS server, or to write prototype attacks. So if we develop new attacks, we can easily write them in TLS-Attacker to check if they actually work. TLS-Attacker was successfully in finding vulnerabilities in OpenMS, Botan matrices, and lots of other TLS libraries. And if you want, you can actually download TLS-Attacker. It's open source. We make it available for everyone, and we still maintain it under this address. And you can clone it, but you can also find it on the virtual machine we provided, which I think is now downloadable again. But we will also provide a different link. The Google Drive link stopped working. Okay, so what is TLS-Attacker actually? So TLS-Attacker has a custom TLS stack, which is specifically designed to allow all sorts of invalid messages. So previous approaches to TLS analysis, they modified existing TLS stacks and added their exploits oftentimes within those implementations, or they wrote custom Python scripts to execute their specific needs. But this caused the community to rewrite those tools over and over again. So instead, TLS-Attacker has this custom TLS stack, which is specifically designed to allow all sorts of invalid messages and does not crash underneath you. So for example, if you want to send elliptic curve point, which is not an elliptic curve, you can simply send this with TLS-Attacker, and TLS-Attacker will just compute anything with this invalid curve points and continue with communication. You do not need to bother with patching the implementation such that it can actually work with its invalid points, for example. TLS-Attacker supports clients and servers, so you can either run TLS-Attacker as a client, as a server, or you can also do man-in-the-middle attacks. And TLS-Attacker basically supports all the TLS features that are available. So it supports all the different versions except SSL version 2, which we only partially support. It also supports DTLS, the TLS over UDP. It supports almost all Cipher suites. So we always try to implement everything. There are only very exotic ones which we are currently missing. And we also support most of the available TLS extensions. So we're always trying to catch up. So when we define new extension, we always try to add them fast so that you actually can evaluate the security of extension or the implications of extension. TLS-Attacker also supports all the different message flows, like which we did not touch in this talk, but like renegotiation, resumption, or client authentication, which are like special modes you can run TLS in to get different features. It also supports legacy compatibility layers like star TLS, where you which is used in email communication. It supports zero RTT and much, much more. So basically, we try to really integrate everything into TLS-Attacker, even if it is insecure or should otherwise not be used, but it's fine in TLS-Attacker because it's a framework for analysis, so we can add all these insecure features, and we do not need to bother to implement them securely because we only use TLS-Attacker for the protocol analysis.
And so you can imagine as we started to designing TLS-Attacker, so we thought about also patching different libraries like OpenSSL and make them vulnerable or make them execute different protocol modifications. But in the long time, it would not be manageable, and you could not be able to include all the insecure ciphers and so on inside of some older implementations. So therefore, there was this decision to completely develop everything from the scratch.
Yeah, so the core concept of TLS-Attacker is the so-called workflow trace. And the workflow trace is basically a protocol flow which you want to execute. So in order to use TLS-Attacker, you have to go through 3 different stages. The first stage is you have to plan the connection you want to establish. Then you execute your plan, and then you evaluate it afterwards if everything worked out. So in this example, we have 3 different actions we want to execute, and TLS-Attacker will execute them one after the other. The first action is a send action where we send a client hello message. So TLS-Attacker should send a client hello message. Then we execute a receive action, and here we are planning on the messages we want to expect the server to send. So we say, oh, we expect that you send a server hello message, and you should follow it up with an encrypted extension message, certificate verify, and a finished message. And then we plan our next action. We say, okay, after we have received this action, we want to send a finished message. And in this case, for example, we want to send an application message. We can then pass this workflow trace to TLS-Attacker to execute it. And then we can look at the execution and see, get the results of execution. In TLS-Attacker, you can define those workflow traces in different ways. So one way is to write an XML file, which basically describes how a workflow trace should look like. You see this on the left part. So basically, this is there's a send action. So you send a client hello message, and you receive a message action where you send your expected messages. And then you have another send message where you send the finished message and the application data message. So this is perfectly what I just visualized in the previous slide. And on the right side, you see what is a Java representation. So TLS-Attacker is written in Java. And you can also use TLS-Attacker as a library and send it directly from Java. So if you do not like XML so much, or if you want to automate your analysis, you can use a simple interface, and it's basically the same. So you have a workflow trace object, and you add different actions to this workflow trace with actions TLS-Attacker should execute. In this case, the send action with a client hello message, then followed by the receive action, then followed by another send action.
Yeah, so also in the virtual machine, you have prepared NetBeans and IntelliJ. So if you want to play with TLS-Attacker, you can directly start with TLS-Attacker in implementation and usage in Java if you want. But of course, from the high-level perspective, we recommend to use these XML-based workflow traces. These are much easier to use.
So if you now want to execute your workflow trace and pass it to TLS-Attacker, TLS-Attacker will again first send the client hello message. Then it will try to execute a receive message, receive the messages, and then it will send the finished and the application data messages. But in TLS-Attacker, there are not only send and receive actions, we have also more complicated actions. For example, the generic receive action is an action where you do not know how the server will exactly behave. So you can just say, okay, just receive something for some time and then get back to me with whatever you have received. Or we have a reconnect actions. For example, if your analysis requires multiple handshake, like we have seen with a zero RTT analysis, maybe a TLS attacker needs to reconnect and start a new connection, when you can use the reconnect action. Or for man-in-the-middle attacks, you can use a forward action where you forward some data from one host to another. So TLS attacker actually supports connection flows with more than 2 parties. So you can have up to infinitely many parties which communicate in a single TLS attacker workflow trace. There's also a wait action. For example, if you have to synchronize something or you have to run some other script, so you can tell TLS attacker to wait 10 seconds, and then you can run your Python script, and then you can TLS attacker will continue after 10 seconds. Or there are other performance optimizations like the receive till action, where you can say, okay, just receive messages until you receive this messages, and then we can continue. Or for example, for star TLS support, you can send the send ASCII action, where you can send the star TLS commands and then follow it up with their normal send and receive messages to execute a star TLS handshake. So in total, we have roughly 60 different pre-built actions, but you can also build your own actions to control how TLS attacker executes a workflow trace. But one important aspect is that TLS attacker should never crash. It should always be able to execute whatever workflow trace you pass it. And if you imagine your TLS attacker in this connection, and this is the workflow trace you get passed, and you should send an RSA client key exchange message, you have a problem, because you just started the connection, you haven't talked to the server even yet, so you do not know the public key from the server, you do not know anything about the server basically, but you still are supposed to send a client key exchange message. So what should TLS attacker do with the contents of this message? So what we did in TLS attacker, we created the concept of configs. So config basically tells TLS attacker how to behave. There's a default config, which is inside of TLS attacker, which is designed for a TLS 1.2 connection. And it has all the default values for all the things that could happen within a TLS connection. And this default config can be overwritten by the user to change the behavior of TLS attacker. So per default, nothing is hard-coded. You can change really everything in TLS attacker. And it has like 280-ish different switches, which you can put different values in. For example, the default server modulus, if you haven't received a certificate with an RSA modulus, well, then use the one from the config. So here's an example config where we override the default configuration. So here we say, oh, we want a highest protocol version. We want to use TLS 1.3 instead of whatever is in the default config. And for the client-supported Cipher Suites, we want to use this TLS AES GCM Cipher Suite and also the TLS AES 256 GCM Cipher Suite. And as an application data, we want to say send the string a lamo if we ever send application data message. And if we create new hello messages, we also want to add the encrypt the MAC extension. So you can see how this can control how your messages will actually end up looking like. Okay, so now you might ask, do I need to configure everything? Well, no. So TLS attacker will always try to create a valid connection for you. So, and if you do not, for example, if you send a client hello message, the server will respond to the serverless message and send its certificate message. TLS attacker will always prefer the messages is received within a connection to the values you have configured. So if we send an RSA modulus, TLS attacker will use this RSA modulus to compute other messages and will not use the message you configured. So what if you actually do want to do something TLS attacker? Oh, I have an example, sorry. I skipped ahead of myself. So this is basically the exact example. So here we send a client hello, we receive a serverless certificate server done message. If we now send a client key exchange message, we will respect the values from the certificate message in our client key exchange message. And we will not use the values from the config. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. So what if we actually do want to use a different value? So in that case, TLS attacker has concept of modifiable variables. And basically every value inside of TLS attacker is implemented as such a modifiable variable. And these modifiable variables are basically basic data types like integers, bytes, byte arrays, strings, and so on. And they allow you to place special hooks in the code so that when they are accessed, they return different code, different values. So for example, here we have a modifiable integer, I, and if we set it to a value of 30 and then add a modification afterwards, so we set a modification at modification 20, whenever we will access the value of this modifiable integer, we will get 30 plus 20. So we will get 50 instead of the original 30 we actually set into this. And this allows basically TLS Attacker to, allows the user of TLS Attacker to have hooks wherever in the code to create the invalid messages he desires. There are a lot of different modifications. For example, like you can compute something XOR, you can shuffle the bytes, you can delete bytes, you can add bytes, and stuff like that, which is also very useful if you want to do fuzzing, where you want to invalidate messages semi-arbitrarily.
Maybe the best motivation for these modifications, maybe you would say that it seems to be stupid or easy or not useless, but actually it's quite useful if you want to execute deep modifications in your protocol flow. So this is just an example of a protocol workflow trace where you send a heartbeat message. And you can imagine if you would try to implement Heartbleed using OpenSSL or patch OpenSSL or use Botan or different library and try to do this on your own by patching the implementation, you would need a few lines of code, you would need to recompile the source code and so on, deploy the application. In case of TLS Attacker, you can use modifiable variables and you can say something like this. So I would like to send a heartbeat message whose payload length is modified by 20,000. So there is an integer add modification which causes the original payload length to be increased by 20,000 when sending the message. Okay. So now it's your turn, Robert.
Yes. So we prepared a demo, and I will
so
steal
I can
the
stop sharing, and you will.
I will steal the show.
Oh, I can see now.
What can you see
here?
So this should show you my VM, right? Can you see everything? You right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so we are now inside the virtual machine, and I have basically two shells here. On the left side, we are in the TLS Attacker folder, and they're specifically in the apps folder, which contains a few binaries which you can allow you to use TLS Attacker from a command line. So if I show you, so there's a client which you can execute client connection with. There's a server where you can execute server connections with, man-in-middle tool, and additional tools which you can play around with. But what today we want to do is we want to be a TLS server with TLS Attacker, and specifically want to be a TLS 103 server. And for the demo, I'm now not using OpenSSL anymore, which Juraj showed, but instead I will be using an older version of WolfSSL. So WolfSSL is another TLS implementation, and this one is specifically designed also for IoT devices, very flexible, and can run on all sorts of things. So I will not go into the details, but this is the command we execute to connect with a WolfSSL client to a TLS Attacker server. And what we want to do is we want to run the TLS server job, but we want to execute it with a specific workflow trace. And with that, for that purpose, I prepared something. So in the TLS Attacker home folder, there's this folder called examples. And there are different examples in there which you can load into TLS Attacker to try it out. And for a benign TLS 103 handshake from a server's perspective, I have this TLS 103 server, TLS 103 trace.xml. And if we look at that, we can see that there's a workflow trace, and it starts with a receive action because the server has to receive a client hello message first. So we expect the client hello message. And then we send our own messages. And what we do is we send a server hello message, and we send some specific extensions. We send the keyshare extension and the supported version extension. And then we follow it up with a chain cipher spec message, encrypted extension, certificate verify, and finished message, just like in the slides. So it's just a benign connection. And we then expect to receive some chain cipher spec and finished message. And afterwards, we will also print any application data we might have received. So, okay. And what I also got is I got a TLS 103 configuration file. So as I already mentioned briefly, TLS Attacker is default configured for TLS 102. So we actually need to reconfigure it to use TLS-103 default values. So, and for that purpose, we have this examples. We have the TLS-103 config.xml. And this basically is a default configuration which tells Tls Attacker to use TLS-103. So what it does, it sets the highest version to TLS-103. The default server supported Cipher Suites, it chooses to TLS-103 Cipher Suites. It sets a server supported group, namely SecP256R1. And it says as the supported versions for the supported version extension, for example, we also set TLS-103. We default select SecP256R1, and we also choose a default selected Cipher Suite, which is a TLS-103 Cipher Suite, and so on. So we have some default configuration to change Tls Attacker from TLS-102 to TLS-103. And if we want to execute that with Tls Attacker, we can start the Tls Attacker server by writing Java -jar TS server. And then we can define the port our server will be running on, and we will choose port 4433 for this demo. And when we will load the workflow trace in. So what we can type is workflow underscore input, and then the path to the workflow trace we want to load. In our case, this is in examples, and it's the TLS-103 trace.xml. And then we can specify the config we want to use, and that is with a config flag. And we can specify the example TLS-103 config.xml. And if we execute that, Tls Attacker will load the trace, will load the config, and will wait for an incoming client connection. And if we then start the WFS client, we can actually observe the connection. So what we can see is that Tls Attacker, I will make this bigger in a second. Okay. So first Tls Attacker was waiting for a connection, but then a client connected from client port 51862. Then we received, executed the receive action, and we actually received the client hello message. When we are executing our own send action, which sent a server hello, change cipher spec, encrypted extension, certificate verify and finished message. And then we execute our received action. And if you remember, we configured is to receive a change cipher spec and the finished message, but instead we received the finished message in the application message. So whenever there is a difference between what you expect and what you receive, Tls Attacker can be configured to handle it differently, but you can also automatically verify if everything is all right. And then last but not least, our application message, our last action is executed, which prints the received application data, where with as a default writes hello with us. And then I see there's a question in the chat. The TLS-103 examples are in the VM, but not on GitHub. No, these specific ones are not on GitHub. Sorry, we are only in the VM. Okay, so what you can do now is you can also start Tls Attacker with the debug flag, and this tells Tls Attacker to print a lot of internal stuff about the TLS connection on the screen. So I will just repeat the same client, and without looking at the details, you can see that Tls Attacker now prints all sorts of internal variables, like all the secrets and all the computations it did. So you can actually see what's going on. But this is often not so helpful if you are not so deep into TLS. So what you can also do instead is you can, similar as to with OpenSSL, you can specify a keylog file. And then Tls Attacker will write this keylog file, which you can then read with Wireshark to decrypt your messages. So you could use this to actually decrypt the messages exchanged. And I think I will maybe not show this now because I think we're already quite progress with the time. But what I want to show you is I want to show you how you can execute some example text. And for that, I brought you two flaws in older versions of WFS. So they are now fixed. And but it still demonstrates how you can attack TLS-103 connections with Tls Attacker. So WFS 4.4.0 had a bug where if the attacker would skip the certificate verify message, so he would not prove that he actually knows the private key to the server, WFS clients would actually accept this. And for that purpose, I brought an example, which is Wolf SSL CVE 2020-24613. And if we look at this workflow trace, oops, it looks very similar to the one before. So we receive a client hello message, or we expect to receive a client hello message. And then we send a server hello message, the chain cipher spec message, the encrypted extension message, the certificate message, but we do not send the certificate verify message. And the purpose of certificate verify message was to prove that we know the private key. If we do not prove that we know the private key, then any man-in-the-middle attacker could have performed the same handshake and could have impersonated the server. So it just then continues with a finished message, and the client is then expected to just send a chain cipher spec and finished message. And in the end, we also print the last sended application data message. So if we execute this now, we can just change the workflow trace we loaded in. So instead of the benign TS103 trace, we load in the Wolf SSL CVE 2020-24613.authentication bypass XML. And I will also start Wireshark so we can actually see what's going on. So, whoops. Let me quickly make this a little bit bigger. Okay, it's, yeah, started. Okay, so I will execute this trace. And now if a client connects to the server, we can see that we received the client hello message. We executed the server hello chain cipher spec encrypted extension certificate finished. We did not send the certificate verify message, but still the client responded with a finished message and application data message. So he still did not notice that the connection was actually tampered with, I would say. So he did not notice that he did not prove the possession of a private key and finished the handshake. And if we look at this in Wireshark, oops. 1 second. Looks like this. So what we can do is we can apply the filter, just like Juraj showed. And when we will see the different messages, and we do not see much, so what we can do is we can go to protocol preferences and add our pre-master secret log file. And I will browse to it, and it's under Tls-Attacker apps. There's my keylog file. And if I load it in, we can see exactly what happened. So we can see that the certificate verify message is missing here, and that the client did not notice and just transmit its application data, hello Wolf SSL. So this was not actually found by us, but found by another team. And Wolf SSL patched the issue. So if we try to do the same thing with like a newer client, like Wolf SSL 5.0, we can execute the same command. And we will see that Wolf SSL notices that the messages are out of order and that a message is missing, and will send an alert message. So on the TLS attacker side, if we skip the certificate verify message here, now we receive an unexpected message instead of application data. So this is actually secure against this attack. But this is, implementation is vulnerable against another authentication bypass, which I'm going to show you now. So I prepared another workflow trace for that. So it's also in the examples folder, and it's under Wolf SSL 2021-3336 authentication bypass. And let's look at this one. So here it starts off with exactly the same. We receive a client hello message. We send a server hello message. Then we send a chain cipher spec. We send an encrypted extension message, and then we send a certificate message. But now something interesting happens, namely I added a modification. So what I do is I say the certificate bytes you're sending, please change the value of those, and namely change them to this explicit value, and then there's nothing. So what I tell TLS attacker here is just do not send a certificate message. Just send an empty certificate message, and then go on with whatever you're doing. So then I send a certificate verify message again. Otherwise, I will get the certificate out of order, the message out of order exception from Wolf SSL, and finish the handshake with a finished message and expect the client to do the same. The thing is, the certificate verify message should prove the possession of a private key, and now I do not have a private key. So what TLS attacker will do here is will actually just send compute it with as if it would have sent a certificate message, but it did not. So if we execute this workflow now, so we change the workflow trace we're executing with to ZUE 2021. And we run this. And we start the WolfSL client. Then again, we see that the handshake executed as or semi as planned. We get application data from WolfSL, although we did not present a certificate message. And we can actually verify this with Wireshark. So here's the connection. I still have a key file loaded, so we can decrypt everything. And here you can see the messages we sent. And here is the certificate message. And if I open this up here, it shows you us with all the details of the certificate message. And if we look at the content, it's only 4 bytes long, and there's nothing in there. It just says an empty length field. So it just says there's nothing in there. And the certificate verify message we sent, so which proves actually our possession of a private key, just contains some random data. So it cannot actually be actually verified. Yeah, so there's some algorithm in there, there's some signature in there, but there's nothing to be verified because we did not send a public key. And what happens is that the WolfSL client is perfectly fine in accepting this message and also sends application data. So in both cases, I showed that due to clever modifications with the messages, so you're either removing a message or you're sending a modified message, you can trick the client into connecting to you, although you did not have a private key. So you can just download a certificate from somewhere and impersonate any server WolfSL client tries to connect to. So, and last but not least, I would like to show you that it's actually patched in the newest version. So I run the trace again, and this time I connect with WolfSL 470, where this was fixed. And in this case, it notices that the signature is invalid and will abort the connection. So we get a fatal decrypt error instead. So this demo was not intended to show you that WolfSL is bad, because implementing these TLS libraries is really, really complicated. As you might have noticed, there are lots of different details, a lot of different cryptographic algorithms, and you have to support all of these at the same time and can make the code super messy and super hard to work with. And what you need to do is you need tools which can verify that your code is actually working. And you cannot do this like with a command line, because you actually need to modify the message contents and dynamically compute the messages. For example, the certificate message we sent here was actually encrypted, and the keys depend on the previous messages exchanged. So you need some dynamic analysis tool to do this, which makes this really, really hard in practice. Okay, and with that, I can conclude with the demos so far for today, and we can go back to the slides.
Okay, so thank you very much for the demo, Robert. So I hope that you were able to see how easy it is to develop new attacks and so on with TLS Attacker. So if you could imagine doing this with OpenSL or with other tools, this would be much, much harder. What we wanted also to say is that TLS Attacker can not only be used as a standalone tool that you use for developing attacks or your workflow traces. On top of TLS Attacker, we have also developed TLS Scanner, which uses TLS Attacker as a library and allows you to scan for vulnerabilities like padding oracle attacks, Bleichenbacher attacks, Raccoon, crime, and so on and so on. So all these attacks that you know from the recent slides and from the TLS history. We are scientific researchers, so we use TLS Attacker also for different automatic or advanced analysis when we scanned the internet for padding oracle vulnerabilities. This was published in 2019, I think. Then we analyzed state learning attacks. So with LearnLib, we were able to analyze the state machines of different DTLS stacks and learn what bugs do they include. We also performed timing measurements with a TLS Attacker. This is some kind of not that easy, so you need to use specific hardware for it, but it works. So because TLS Attacker was not developed with performance in mind, we use specific hardware accelerator card, which allows us to do these timing measurements. And we also do automatic testing, fuzzing, and so on. So there is a lot what can be done, what TLS Attacker is useful for.
So generally, TLS Attacker is not so nice if you want to do high performance attacks. So for example, the Suite 32 attacks requires that you transmit gigabytes and gigabytes of data, so maybe up to a terabyte of data. And in those cases, TLS Attacker is not performing so well because TLS Attacker was not, as you already mentioned, it's not designed for high performance. It's designed for flexibility and for agility. So if you would want to implement like real offensive tools which exploit millions of connections or stuff like that, then TLS Attacker is definitely the wrong choice, and you should probably start from scratch. So NSA, sorry if you're listening, it's not a tool for you. Okay, to conclude, we saw that TLS 103 is the best version of TLS we have currently. It's deprecated all the different features we do not want anymore, and it fixed many mistakes of the past. So all the research from all these years of TLS attacks got into TLS 103, and there are currently almost no known attacks against TLS 103. There's only the replay attack, which was known from the start, and there is a selfie attack, which is arguably not a real attack. So it's only a minor design flaw. But still, we saw that still there could be vulnerabilities. Like, for example, I showed the two authentication bypasses in WolfSL, and they can be, currently, they can be very implementation specific. So what worked for WolfSL will probably not work for other implementations, but at least there are no general TLS design flaws. And we also showed you TLS Attacker, which you can use to find these flaws. And so you do not need to write Python scripts to analyze things anymore. And you can benefit from all the development which we put into TLS Attacker. And with that, I hope you give TLS Attacker a try and maybe try to find some vulnerabilities and maybe help us to improve the TLS ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you very much also from my side for your attention. So I hope that we delivered a tutorial that you thought about to be delivered, or what we promised, and that you enjoyed it and learned something about TLS 1.3 and analyzing the ecosystem. Okay, so I think
there's
there
one
are
more question.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, there's one question from Doug, and he asks, thanks for the demo. Would we be able to use TLS Attacker to alter the ASN1 string from the 1.1.1 update? So I think the update came in the midst of the talk, so I haven't looked at it yet, but generally TLS Attacker also has an experimental ASN1 and X509 stack. So you will probably have to write some code or define the ASN1 modifications beforehand. But principally it is possible, but it's not super well documented because it's a very new experimental feature from us.
Okay.
There's another question from Alexander. He asks, how many sites have switched to TLS 103 yet? I think you're right. We have the numbers from a few weeks ago, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't get this question.
How many sites have switched to TLS 103 yet?
Was it like 50% from?
Yeah, it depends who you ask. So the most prominent websites have, lots of them have already switched. But if you look at smaller websites or like router firmware, so stuff like that, they have mostly not switched. So the most connections will probably be using TLS 103, like Google, Cloudflare, and so on. But other sites probably not so much.
If you're asking about numbers and so on, okay, sorry. Then there is this SLabs project which allows you to test your server. So maybe you've heard it, but there is also a project called SSL Pulse, which scans the internet like every month and provides fresh numbers. So in case you want to take a look at how many implementations are supporting TLS 1.3, and or how many servers, according to this website, there are between 40 and 50% that are supporting TLS 1.3. These are only 150% of the most prominent servers in the TLS ecosystem. So probably the numbers are much lower on the IPv4 scale, but you can imagine that yeah, using these you have some numbers here for the most important servers in the ecosystem. I hope that this answers the question. Okay. I'm sorry. You can of course switch for audio. Yeah, yes, of course, Alex.
Hey, thank you. Excellent talk and excellent demo. Thank you very much for everything. I have another question. It seems to me that the differentiation between TLS 1.2 and .3 more or less depends on the number and the kinds of extensions provided in the client hello, server hello. So I wonder if it's not possible to cause some confusion by flooding either peer of the communication with any number of extensions, correct ones, incorrect ones, and just hope that the implementation is somehow wrong and gets confused. Have you any experiences with that?
Okay, so what you are referring to are probably some kind of protocol confusion or downgrade attacks that could be executed. So
yes, basically, maybe not specifically downgrades, but just general causing havoc and confusion.
Okay, so to the best of my knowledge, I am not aware of any of these kinds of attacks. And so the main probably motivation or main reason for this is that at the end of the handshake, once you finalize the handshake, this can be only done with the exchange of the finished messages. And the finished messages are computed based on the key material that was established in the handshake. And every finished message computed with different TLS protocol has different properties. So therefore, switching the TLS version would not help you to confuse or to somehow confuse the protocol implementation. On the different side, so maybe there were confusion attacks on specific messages. For example, in 2012, there were attacks by Mavrogiannopoulos and his colleagues who introduced specific confusions in the server key exchange messages, but these can be prevented by using strict validation, and these are not applicable to TLS 1.3. So basically, even though the messages look very similar, they have different structures underneath and use different cryptographic primitives. So there is that's very hard to somehow confuse a TLS server into like speaking TLS 1.2 or to establish some confusion, because nowadays the implementations, the libraries are quite good implemented, and they check the protocol flow very carefully. So Robert, maybe do you have any idea how to respond to this question?
Yeah, we actually saw servers which could be confused. So usually the servers have both versions implemented alongside by each other. And we actually found examples where if we send malformed messages which are malformed enough, that the server was confused which version he's actually was speaking. He was mixing TLS 1.3 and 1.2 cipher suites and messages. But usually if you do this, you end up in a server state where the connection is very hard to finish. So in that specific case, you could not complete the handshake from that point on. So the server started negotiating this wild mixture of a protocol, but there were no messages you could send to actually finish the connection. But it's definitely interesting. Maybe we can find more examples. Maybe it's possible to do something like that. And you can certainly try. You can use Tls Attacker and you can try to confuse the server into doing weird stuff. And sometimes this works, yeah.
Yeah, this might lead to denial of service attacks, at least, if not broken crypto.
Yeah, so denial of service attacks you can do, I would say, nearly always with some kind of big cryptographic primitives or big cryptographic keys, but or with many resources. But as Robert mentioned, this can be somehow, to some extent, can be executed. But the question is, what do you win in beyond the denial of service attack? So, yeah. So,
yeah, of course, sure.
To finalize the handshake, that's very, very hard. But yeah, but it's a good idea. It's a good idea.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions? It seems like not to be the case. So, Georg, I think that's now your turn. You should unmute yourself.
It so much helps to open the microphone if you want to be heard. It's always such a new experience. And thank you, Juraj, Professor Dr. Juraj Somorovsky from Paderborn University, and Robert Merget, PhD student from Ruhr University, Bochum. Thank you in the audience for participating. In 2 weeks, on September 8th, we have 4 speakers. I hope I pronounced them well, but they're not listening anyway. Ya Zhao, Miles France, Charmin Afros, and Professor Danfeng Yao from the Department of Computer Science of Virginia Tech, USA. They will talk about principles and practices of secure cryptographic coding in Java. Various software libraries and frameworks provide a variety of APIs to support secure coding. However, misusing these APIs can cost developers tremendous time and effort, introduce security vulnerabilities to software, and cause serious consequences like data leakage or denial of service DOS on servers, DOS on servers. The tutorial aims to educate people on the best practice of secure coding, the pitfalls that should be avoided, and the detection tools and fixing suggestions of insecure code. Another thing, ESORICS is getting closer, the real conference. We are just doing the run-up tutorials right now. You may now register for the ESORICS conference in October on registration.esorics2021.org. Repeat after me. registration.esorics2021.org. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you in 2 weeks.